Brain pounded mercilessly against the weathered cabin where former Marine Sergeant Mason Reed had secluded himself for the past 3 years. But on this bitter December night, through the howling wind and freezing sleet, came a sound no training had prepared him for. The desperate whimper of a military service dog collapsed on his porch, shivering violently with a tattered tactical vest still clinging to its emaciated frame. Mason couldn't have known that opening his door that night would set into motion an extraordinary chain of events that would not only save this remarkable animal, but would ultimately heal wounds deeper than either of them carried physically. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The northern reaches of Michigan's Upper Peninsula had earned its reputation as one of the most unforgiving winter landscapes in America. By early December, Lake Superior's influence transformed the dense pine forests and rolling hills into a frigid wilderness where temperatures regularly plunged well below zero. Most seasonal residents had long since departed for warmer climates, leaving only the most resilient or isolated souls to endure the brutal months ahead. Mason Reed's cabin sat nestled against a ridge that overlooked a small, unnamed lake, now frozen solid beneath 18 inches of ice. The structure itself betrayed signs of neglect, gutters sagging under accumulated ice, weathered siding that hadn't seen fresh paint in years, and a chimney that leaked thin wisps of smoke from the perpetually burning wood stove inside. An American flag hung from a porch post, its edges frayed, but the fabric meticulously clean, the only external indication that someone within still cared about anything at all. Inside, Mason moved through his evening routine with military precision. At 42, his tall frame remained powerful, despite the pronounced limp in his right leg. His face, once described by fellow Marines as approachable, had hardened into a mask of permanent vigilance, deep lines etched around eyes that had witnessed realities most civilians couldn't comprehend. A thick beard, more salt than pepper, concealed the lower half of his face, while his hair remained cropped close to his scalp, old habits persisting despite 3 years of civilian life. The cabin's interior reflected the mind of a man determined to maintain order amidst inner chaos. Everything had its place. Cooking utensils hung in perfect alignment above a modest stove, canned goods arranged by size and type in the pantry, a medical kit positioned precisely by the door. The walls remained largely bare, except for a shadow box containing medals and insignia from his 15 years of service, mounted beside a photograph of 4 Marines in desert camouflage, arms around each other's shoulders, squinting into harsh sunlight. Mason checked his watch. 2100 hours. He added another log to the wood stove, adjusted the damper, and poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon, his one concession to comfort in an otherwise Spartan existence. The weather forecast crackled through an ancient radio, predicting the season's worst ice storm would intensify overnight. The meteorologist's voice warned listeners that emergency services might be unavailable for extended periods. Mason switched off the radio with a dismissive grunt. Self-sufficiency wasn't a choice for him. It was the only way he knew how to survive. The cabin's isolation hadn't been accidental. After 3 deployments to Afghanistan and the IED explosion that shattered his right leg and ended his military career, Mason had retreated from a world that felt increasingly foreign. Physical therapy, well-intentioned support groups, and the persistent efforts of the few friends who hadn't given up on him, all had failed to penetrate the protective barrier he'd constructed around himself. Here, 40 miles from the nearest town of any significance, surrounded by wilderness, he'd found a measure of peace in the absence of expectations. Mason settled into the worn leather armchair, positioned to face both the wood stove and the cabin's only entrance. Another habit from a lifetime of situational awareness. He opened the dog-eared copy of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations that had been his companion through multiple deployments. The ancient philosopher's stoic wisdom provided one of the few connections to his former self, to the idealistic young man who'd enlisted believing in concepts like duty and purpose. The first howl of wind announced the storm's intensification, rattling the cabin's windows as if testing their resolve. Mason glanced up briefly from his book, mentally calculating whether he'd stockpiled enough firewood should the storm persist longer than forecast. He'd planned to split more logs tomorrow, but if necessary, he could break down some of the fallen timber behind the shed. It was during a momentary lull in the wind that he heard it, a sound so faint he initially dismissed it as ice falling from the eaves. But then it came again, more distinct this time, a whimper, followed by what sounded like scratching against the wooden porch steps. Mason set his book aside, instantly alert. Wildlife encounters weren't uncommon in these woods. He'd had territorial disputes with everything from raccoons to the occasional black bear in warmer months. But animals typically avoided human habitation during severe weather unless desperate, and desperate wildlife was unpredictable. He reached for the shotgun propped beside the door, not with the intention of using it unnecessarily, but tours in combat zones had taught him the value of preparedness. Moving silently despite his injured leg, Mason approached the window adjacent to the door, angling to view the porch without exposing himself directly. What he saw through the frost-edged glass stopped him cold. Collapsed on the weathered planks lay a large dog, its dark fur matted with ice and what appeared to be dried blood. Even in the poor visibility, Mason instantly recognized the distinctive shape of a Belgian Malinois, the same breed that had accompanied his unit on countless missions. The dog's sides heaved with labored breathing, each exhale creating small clouds in the freezing air. More shocking than the animal's appearance was what remained strapped to its torso, the unmistakable remnants of a tactical K9 vest, the kind used by military working dogs in combat zones. Mason lowered the shotgun, momentarily frozen by the impossible sight. Military working dogs were valuable assets, carefully tracked and accounted for. They didn't simply appear on remote porches in the Upper Peninsula, miles from the nearest military installation. Yet the evidence was undeniable. This was a trained service dog, clearly injured, somehow separated from its handler and unit. A sudden, violent gust of wind seemed to rouse the animal. It lifted its head weakly, eyes finding Mason through the window. The dog made no aggressive move, no warning growl, only a soft, almost inaudible whine that seemed to cut through Mason, more effectively than the howling storm outside. Those eyes, Mason had seen that same look before, in the faces of wounded Marines, in his own reflection during the darkest months of his recovery. It was the expression of a warrior pushed beyond endurance, but refusing to surrender. "Damn it," Mason muttered, setting the shotgun aside and reaching for his heavy coat. Every instinct cultivated during his years of solitude screamed against what he was about to do. Involvement meant responsibility. Responsibility meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant pain. He'd constructed his isolated existence precisely to avoid these entanglements. Yet his hand was already on the door handle, his body responding to training deeper than his trauma. You never leave one of your own behind. The core principle that had guided his military service now propelled him forward, despite his reluctance. The blast of icy air as he opened the door staggered him momentarily. The temperature had dropped further, with sleet now transitioning to snow that whipped horizontally across the porch. The dog raised its head at his appearance but made no attempt to rise, a fact that concerned Mason more than if the animal had shown aggression. "Easy there," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He approached slowly, presenting his hand palm down in a non-threatening gesture, assessing the animal with the same tactical precision he'd once applied to field operations. The Malinois was male, probably 3 to 5 years old, based on his size and development. Severe malnourishment had hollowed out his frame, ribs prominently visible even through the thick winter coat. The tactical vest, once desert tan but now stained dark with dirt, and what Mason suspected was blood, bore no visible unit insignia or identification. Most concerning was the dog's right hind leg, which lay at an unnatural angle that suggested a serious injury, possibly a fracture. "What happened to you, boy?" Mason murmured, carefully moving closer. "Where's your handler?" At the word handler, the dog's ears twitched forward, and he attempted to rise, only to collapse again with a sharp yelp of pain. The reaction confirmed Mason's suspicion. This was indeed a trained military working dog, responding to terminology specific to service animals. The wind intensified again, driving needle-sharp sleet that stung Mason's exposed skin. Whatever decisions needed to be made about this unexpected visitor, they couldn't happen on the porch during the worst storm of the season. "All right, let's get you inside," Mason decided, speaking in the calm, authoritative tone he'd learned. Was effective with working dogs. "I'm going to pick you up now. No biting, understood?" Whether from training or exhaustion, the Malinois remained passive, as Mason carefully slid one arm under his chest and the other beneath his haunches, lifting with a grunt of effort. Despite the dog's emaciated condition, he still weighed at least 60 pounds, and Mason's injured leg protested sharply at the awkward burden. The dog's body felt frighteningly cold against him, a core temperature dangerously below normal. As Mason carried him into the cabin's warmth, the animal shivered violently, another concerning sign that hypothermia had set in. Once inside, Mason gently placed the dog on the braided rug before the wood stove, the warmest spot in the cabin. Up close, the animal's condition appeared even more dire. Patches of fur were missing, revealing scarred skin beneath. Old wounds that had healed poorly marked his muzzle and flanks. Whatever journey had brought this dog to Mason's door had been neither short nor kind. "Let's get this vest off you," Mason muttered, carefully unbuckling the tactical harness. The material was stiff with dried mud and other substances he chose not to identify too closely. As he removed it, the dog sighed deeply, as if relieved of a burden carried too long. Mason examined the vest, searching for any identification. Military working dogs and their equipment typically carried multiple forms of identification: tags, embedded microchips, registration numbers. This vest had been deliberately stripped of all such markers, with evidence that patches and labels had been roughly cut away. The mystery deepened, but immediate concerns took precedence. The Malinois needed warmth, hydration, and medical attention. Mason moved with renewed purpose, gathering clean towels, a bowl of water, and the first aid kit he maintained with military thoroughness. As he gently began to dry the dog's fur, Mason found himself speaking aloud, something he rarely did in his self-imposed isolation. "You picked the right porch to collapse on," he told the Malinois, who watched him with intelligent eyes that never left his face. "Not many options out here, but you got lucky. I've patched up worse than this." Whether he was trying to reassure the dog or himself remained unclear, but the simple act of addressing another living being felt strangely comforting after so many months of silence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As dawn broke over the frozen landscape, Mason awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the sound of breathing that wasn't his own. He'd spent the night on the floor beside the wood stove, unwilling to leave the injured Malinois unattended. The dog had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep after Mason had cleaned his wounds, wrapped his injured leg in a makeshift splint, and coaxed him to drink water and accept small pieces of venison from Mason's own dinner. The storm had intensified overnight, transforming the world outside into an impenetrable white void. Wind whistled through the cabin's eaves, and occasional creaks suggested the weight of accumulated snow on the roof. They were effectively cut off from the outside world until the weather cleared, a situation that would normally provide Mason with a sense of security. Instead, he felt an unfamiliar restlessness, as if the dog's unexpected arrival had disrupted more than just his physical space. In the pale morning light filtering through frost-covered windows, Mason took the opportunity to more thoroughly examine his unexpected guest. The Malinois remained asleep, his breathing steadier than the previous night, though occasional twitches and soft whimpers suggested his dreams were far from peaceful. With careful hands, Mason checked the makeshift splint on the dog's hind leg, confirming it remained secure. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Mason murmured, his trained eye cataloguing the evidence of the dog's ordeal. Beyond the obvious recent injuries lay older scars, some clearly surgical, others jagged and haphazard. One particularly troubling mark curved along the dog's left flank, the distinctive pattern of a burn that had healed poorly. Most concerning was a small patch of scarred skin behind the right ear, where something appeared to have been removed, likely a microchip, the standard identification method for military working dogs. The deliberate removal of identification, combined with the modified tactical vest, painted a disturbing picture. This wasn't simply a lost service animal. Someone had intentionally attempted to erase this dog's official identity and history. The Malinois stirred, dark eyes opening to fix on Mason with that same intelligent awareness that had struck him the previous night. There was no fear in that gaze, no aggression, only a wary assessment that reminded Mason startlingly of himself. "Good morning," Mason said, finding himself speaking in the same tone he'd once used with new recruits, professional but not unkind. "Let's check your hydration." He offered the water bowl again, which the dog accepted eagerly, lapping with more strength than he'd shown the previous night. A positive sign, though Mason remained concerned about the animal's severely underweight condition and the possible infection in his injured leg. As the dog drank, Mason found himself studying the distinctive facial markings and coloration more carefully. Something about this particular Malinois struck a chord of familiarity that he couldn't immediately place. He'd worked alongside many military dogs during his deployments, particularly in Afghanistan, where their tracking abilities and protective instincts had proven invaluable. The dog finished drinking and attempted to rise, struggling against the pain in his injured leg. "Easy, soldier," Mason cautioned, placing a steadying hand on the dog's shoulder. "You're not ready for active duty yet." At the phrase "active duty," the Malinois' ears pricked forward sharply, and a visible tremor ran through his body. The reaction was unmistakable, a trained response to specific terminology. Mason had seen it countless times during his service, the way military working dogs responded to particular commands and phrases ingrained through intensive training. A thought occurred to Mason, one that seemed simultaneously improbable and yet strangely compelling. He straightened his posture slightly and in a clear command voice said, "Atlas, sit." The reaction was immediate. Despite his injuries, the dog instantly shifted his weight to his haunches, maintaining as close to a proper sitting position as his splinted leg would allow. His attention focused completely on Mason, awaiting further instruction. Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter storm raging outside. Atlas. The name had come to him seemingly from nowhere, yet the dog's response confirmed its accuracy. But how could he possibly know the name of a military working dog that had somehow appeared on his remote porch during a blizzard? The answer lay buried in the recesses of his memory, in the chaotic fragments of the day that had ended. His military career, the IED explosion in Kandahar province, the frantic evacuation under fire, the helicopter medevac where he drifted in and out of consciousness. In those hazy, pain-filled moments, he recalled a Belgian Malinois being loaded aboard alongside. The wounded, A dog that had been working with an adjacent unit also caught in the blast. "Atlas," Mason repeated softly, recognition dawning. "You were there, the day I got hit." The dog, Atlas, tilted his head slightly, watching Mason with renewed interest, as if trying to place him as well. The coincidence seemed too extraordinary to be believed. Yet the evidence was before him. A military working dog that had been present at the very incident that had forever altered Mason's life, now appearing at his isolated cabin years later, deliberately stripped of identification and bearing signs of mistreatment. The rational part of Mason's mind attempted to construct plausible explanations. Military working dogs were occasionally retired and adopted into civilian life, though the process was tightly regulated. Some were transferred to law enforcement agencies. In extremely rare cases, dogs deemed unsuitable for continued service, due to trauma or behavioral issues, might be removed from the program entirely. None of these standard scenarios explained Atlas's condition or his presence in the remote Michigan wilderness. Whatever had happened to this dog since Afghanistan represented a serious breach of protocols at best, and something far more sinister at worst. Mason's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp transition in the storm's sound. The howling wind had diminished, replaced by the dense silence that often followed heavy snowfall. Moving to the window, he cleared a small circle in the frost to peer outside. The world had been transformed into a monochromatic landscape of white slopes and buried shapes. The storm had passed, but it had left behind at least 2 feet of new snow, effectively sealing them in until Mason could clear a path to the shed and retrieve his snowshoes. The temporary isolation bought time to assess the situation more thoroughly. Atlas needed proper veterinary care for his injuries, particularly the potentially fractured leg, but the nearest clinic was in Marquette, over 40 miles away. More pressing was the mystery of how he had arrived at Mason's cabin and what circumstances had led to his current condition. Returning to the wood stove, Mason added several logs and adjusted the damper to maintain a steady heat. Atlas watched his movements with the focused attention characteristic of his breed, his eyes following Mason's every action. "You need proper food," Mason decided aloud, moving to the kitchen area. "Something to build your strength back." From his well-organized pantry, he selected items suitable for a recovery diet. Plain cooked chicken he'd preserved himself, rice, and some bone broth he'd made from last season's venison. As he prepared a meal appropriate for a malnourished dog, Mason found himself slipping into a forgotten rhythm, the focused efficiency of caring for another being's needs, a purpose beyond mere survival. Atlas accepted the offered food with restrained eagerness, maintaining the disciplined manner of a working dog even in his weakened state. Mason noted that despite his obvious hunger, Atlas waited for permission before eating, another indication of his professional training. "You're no ordinary stray, that's for certain," Mason commented, settling back on his heels to watch the dog eat. "The question is, who went to such lengths to erase your past, and why?" The Malinois paused in his eating, meeting Mason's gaze. With an almost human quality of communication, a shared awareness that they were both caught in circumstances beyond their understanding or control. After finishing his meal, Atlas attempted to stand again, this time with more success. Though obviously favoring his injured leg, he managed to maintain his balance long enough to reposition himself closer to Mason before carefully lying down again. The deliberate movement, requiring considerable effort through pain, struck Mason as profoundly significant. This wasn't simply an animal seeking warmth or food. It was a conscious choice to maintain proximity to a human the dog had identified as trustworthy. The realization created an uncomfortable pressure in Mason's chest. He had structured his isolated existence precisely to avoid responsibility for anyone or anything beyond himself. The complexity of human relationships, with their potential for both connection and devastating loss, had proven too painful after his experiences in combat and the subsequent struggle to reintegrate into civilian life. Yet here was Atlas, a being both simpler and more profound in his needs and offerings, disrupting the careful emotional fortress Mason had constructed. The dog asked for nothing beyond the basics of survival, offered nothing but silent companionship. Yet his presence demanded a response that transcended Mason's self-imposed isolation. As if sensing Mason's internal conflict, Atlas extended his muzzle to gently touch the man's hand, where it rested on the floor between them. The gesture, simultaneously vulnerable and reassuring, broke something loose inside Mason's carefully maintained defenses. "Okay, boy," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "We'll figure this out together." For the first time in longer than he could remember, Mason found himself considering a future that included something beyond mere existence. Whatever had brought Atlas to his door, coincidence, fate, or some complex chain of human actions, had created an unexpected responsibility that Mason couldn't ignore, despite every instinct cultivated during his years of solitude. The decision made, Mason rose and moved to the small desk where he kept his rarely used laptop. The satellite internet connection he maintained primarily for weather reports and occasional supply orders would now serve a different purpose. If he was going to help Atlas properly, he needed information about the dog's potential origins, about the proper treatment for his injuries, and about what protocols existed for military working dogs who had somehow fallen through the official cracks. As the computer powered on, Mason glanced back at Atlas, who watched him with the patient focus of a being accustomed to waiting for orders, for purpose, for connection. In that steady gaze lay both a challenge and an invitation, a call to step beyond the confines of isolated survival and into the messier, riskier territory of actual living. "Let's find out who's looking for you," Mason said, fingers poised over the keyboard, "and whether they deserve to find you." The storm's passing had left behind a world transformed by snow. But inside the cabin, a different kind of transformation had begun, one less visible but potentially more profound. For the first time since retreating to the wilderness, Mason Reed found himself facing forward rather than attempting to outrun his past. Mason's research into military working dogs stretched from morning into afternoon, the hours passing unnoticed. As he navigated through official websites, veterans' forums, and news articles, Atlas remained close, occasionally shifting position to ease pressure on his injured leg, but never straying far from Mason's side. The dog's vigilant presence created an odd sense of companionship that Mason hadn't experienced since leaving the service, a silent partnership that required no conversation, but somehow filled the cabin's emptiness. The information he gathered painted a complex picture. Military working dogs were considered equipment in official terminology, but treated with far more respect and care in practice. Their training represented an investment of thousands of dollars and countless hours. When they reached retirement, age or could no longer serve effectively, a structured process existed for their transition, typically offering the dog's handler first opportunity for adoption, followed by law enforcement agencies or carefully screened civilians. What didn't exist was any legitimate scenario where a highly trained dog like Atlas would end up emaciated, injured, and stripped of identification in the Michigan wilderness. "Someone went to considerable trouble to make you disappear," Mason told the Malinois, who raised his head at being addressed. "The question is why?" Mason's military experience had taught him to trust patterns rather than coincidences. The deliberate removal of Atlas's microchip and identification, the dog's appearance at his specific cabin during a blizzard, These suggested intentional action rather than random circumstance. The fact that this particular dog had been present during the explosion that ended Mason's military career added another layer of improbability that couldn't be dismissed. Mason closed the laptop and pinched the bridge of his nose, fighting the headache that had begun to form behind his eyes. The investigation had raised more questions than answers. Without Atlas's service number or unit assignment, Mason had no way to access his official records or determine his status. The dog was, in bureaucratic terms, a ghost. First things first, Mason decided aloud, reaching for his satellite phone. Let's get that leg properly examined. The call to the veterinary clinic in Marquette confirmed his concerns about immediate travel. The main roads might be cleared by tomorrow, but the unplowed Forest Service road leading to his cabin would remain impassable for at least 3 days. The vet, Dr. Abernathy, listened patiently to Mason's description of Atlas's injuries and provided instructions for continued care until they could reach the clinic. Keep that splint clean and dry, the doctor advised. Monitor for increased swelling or heat that might indicate infection. Based on your description, I'm concerned about malnutrition and possible dehydration as well. Can you check his gums for me? Mason gently lifted Atlas's lip, noting the pale pink color of his gums. Lighter than they should be, he reported, recalling training he'd received on field assessment of wounded service dogs. Consistent with anemia from poor nutrition, Dr. Abernathy confirmed. He'll need a comprehensive workup when you get here, but for now, small meals frequently will be better than overwhelming his system. And Mason, whatever his story is, you've probably saved this dog's life by taking him in. The veterinarian's words lingered after the call ended. Mason had acted on instinct rather than conscious choice, responding to Atlas's need with the ingrained reflexes of his military training. The idea that this reflexive action might represent something more significant, a purposeful rescue rather than mere circumstance, created an uncomfortable pressure beneath his sternum. Outside, the afternoon sun had emerged, casting brilliant light across the snow-covered landscape. The temperature would drop precipitously after sunset, but for now, the cabin's interior had grown almost uncomfortably warm. Mason opened the door to allow fresh air to circulate, propping it with a wooden wedge. Atlas immediately raised his head, nostrils flaring as he processed the outdoor scents. His entire demeanor changed, muscles tensing, ears forward, eyes focused intently on the open doorway. A low growl emerged from his throat, so soft it was barely audible. Mason froze, instantly alert to the Malinois' warning. During his deployments, he had witnessed the uncanny accuracy with which these dogs detected threats beyond human perception. That same focused intensity now directed toward the open door suggested Atlas had sensed something concerning in the surrounding forest. Moving with deliberate calm, Mason retrieved his binoculars from their place beside the window. The elevated position of his cabin provided clear sightlines to the main approach through the pines, now transformed into a white corridor by the heavy snowfall. Carefully scanning the tree line, Mason saw nothing immediately alarming. No movement, no tracks, no evidence of human or large animal presence. Yet Atlas continued his low warning, eyes fixed on a specific section of the forest to the northwest. Mason adjusted his focus to that area, methodically examining each shadow between the trees. At first, nothing seemed amiss, but as he continued his survey, a detail caught his attention, a slight irregularity in the snow pattern approximately 200 yards from the cabin. Narrowing his focus, Mason recognized what his subconscious had already registered, partially obscured boot prints leading away from the cabin, not toward it. Someone had approached during the night or early morning, then departed without making their presence known. The implications sent a surge of adrenaline through Mason's system. His isolated location was known to very few people: the supply delivery service from Marquette, a handful of park rangers, and 2 former Marines who occasionally checked on him despite his reluctance. None would have reason to approach covertly during a blizzard, nor to leave without contact. "Good boy," Mason said quietly to Atlas, whose warning had revealed a threat Mason would otherwise have missed entirely. The dog's ears flicked in acknowledgement, but his posture remained vigilant, gaze still locked on the forest. Mason made a rapid assessment of the situation. The tracks suggested a single individual who had approached from the Forest Service road, circled the cabin at a distance, then departed along the same route. The timing aligned disturbingly well with Atlas's arrival, as if someone had followed. The dog confirmed his location, then withdrawn to report or regroup. The phantom visitor's purpose remained unclear, but their presence transformed Atlas from a mysterious stray into something more significant, a being someone had tracked through a blizzard to a remote cabin. Whether they intended to recover the dog or confirm his whereabouts, their covert approach suggested motives that likely didn't align with Atlas's welfare. Mason closed and locked the door, checking each window as a matter of habit before returning to Atlas. The dog had relaxed marginally with the door secured, but maintained his alertness, occasionally glancing at Mason as if confirming they shared awareness of the potential threat. "You're not just lost, are you?" Mason said, kneeling beside the Malinois. "You were running from something, or someone." Atlas met his gaze with that same unsettling intelligence, neither confirming nor denying, but somehow communicating understanding beyond words. The connection between them had shifted subtly. They were no longer simply rescuer and rescued, but allies against an unknown threat. Mason moved through the cabin with renewed purpose, retrieving his go-bag from beneath the bed, a waterproof duffel containing essential supplies, documentation, emergency funds, and his service weapon, maintained out of habit rather than any expected need. The familiar weight of preparation settled his thoughts, channeling concern into productive action. "We need more information," he told Atlas, who watched his movements with focused attention. "And I think I know who might have." "It." Mason retrieved his satellite phone again, scrolling to a contact he hadn't used in over 18 months. Captain Diane Rivera had served as a military working dog program coordinator during Mason's last deployment. After retirement, she had transitioned to a civilian role with the Department of Defense, maintaining connections to both military and law enforcement K-9 programs. More importantly, she had been one of the few people who hadn't stopped checking on Mason after his medical discharge, sending occasional messages despite his minimal responses. The call connected after 4 rings, Diane's voice sharp with surprise. "Mason Reed, is that really you?" "It's me," he confirmed, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd initiated contact with anyone from his former life. "I need your expertise on something urgent. Are you all right?" The immediate concern in her voice made Mason realize how his unexpected call might be interpreted. "I'm fine," he assured her, "but I have a situation involving a military working dog that doesn't make sense." There was a brief pause before Diane responded, her tone shifting from personal concern to professional focus. "Tell me exactly what you're dealing with." Mason provided a concise description of Atlas's condition, the missing identification, and his apparent recognition of the dog from the Kandahar incident. He omitted the detail about the tracks outside the cabin for now, focusing on establishing the dog's identity first. Belgian Malinois, approximately 5 years old, tactical K-9 vest with identification removed, responds to the name Atlas, Diane repeated. "And you believe he was present during the IED incident in 2019? "Almost certain," Mason confirmed. "His response to military commands is textbook. This isn't a civilian dog, Diane. Something's very wrong here. Another pause, longer this time. When Diane spoke again, her voice had lowered slightly. Atlas was listed as killed in action, Mason. According to official records, he died in the same explosion that injured you. The information hit Mason with physical force, momentarily, robbing him of response. He looked at Atlas, very much alive, despite obvious hardship, watching him with alert attention from his position near the wood stove. "That's impossible," Mason finally managed. "He's right here in my cabin." "I believe you," Diane said, her voice tight with what sounded like controlled anger. "And it confirms something I've suspected for months. Mason, I need you to listen carefully. If you have Atlas, you and he may both be in serious danger." The warning aligned too perfectly with the mysterious tracks outside, transforming a troubling situation into something potentially life-threatening. Mason felt the familiar clarity of combat awareness settling over him, the heightened perception and emotional detachment that had kept him alive through 3 deployments. "I'm listening," he said, reaching instinctively to rest his hand on Atlas's head. The dog leaned into his touch, a silent affirmation of the alliance neither had consciously chosen, but both now acknowledged. "There have been rumors," Diane explained, her voice deliberately measured, "about a classified program using experienced military dogs for operations outside normal protocols. Nothing official, nothing I could prove, just patterns of discrepancies. In records, dogs listed as deceased whose bodies were never returned, handlers reassigned abruptly after asking questions." Mason processed this information against his knowledge of military operations. Black Ops using military working dogs. "Something like that," Diane confirmed. "But here's where it gets complicated. These operations wouldn't be sanctioned through official channels. We're talking about a rogue element, potentially, operating within legitimate structures." The implications were disturbing on multiple levels. Military working dogs represented years of specialized training and significant investment. Their capabilities in detection, protection, and tactical operations made them invaluable assets. Assets that, in unscrupulous hands, could be deployed for purposes far removed from their intended function. "Atlas escaped," Mason concluded. "The pieces beginning to align, and someone wants him back. If I'm right, they'll go to extraordinary lengths to recover him," Diane warned. "These dogs aren't just valuable assets, they're evidence of unauthorized operations. Mason, you need to get Atlas to a secure location as soon as possible. I have contacts who can help, but first, you both need to be somewhere less isolated." As if understanding the gravity of their conversation, Atlas shifted closer to Mason, his body warm against the man's leg in a gesture that seemed simultaneously protective and seeking protection. "The roads are impassable for at least 3 days, Mason told her, mind already calculating alternatives. "And if someone's watching the cabin, moving through 2 feet of snow with an injured dog won't be easy." "Make a plan," Diane instructed, the command in her voice familiar from their service days. "I'll make calls to people I trust absolutely and arrange a secure handoff once you can travel. Document everything, Atlas's condition, any identifying markers, his responses to specific commands. The more evidence we have, the better chance of exposing whatever operation he was part of." After ending the call, Mason stood at the window, watching as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow. Atlas remained beside him, their reflections visible in the glass. A man and dog united by circumstances neither could have anticipated, facing a threat whose dimensions were only beginning to become clear. "Looks like we both got a second chance. We weren't supposed to have," Mason told the Malinois quietly, "and someone isn't happy about it." For the first time in 3 years, Mason Reed felt the stirring of something beyond mere survival, a purpose that demanded engagement rather than retreat. The isolated existence he had carefully constructed now felt less like refuge and more like vulnerability. Whatever danger Atlas had brought to his door had shattered the illusion that the past could be escaped simply by hiding from it. As evening settled over the snowbound landscape, Mason methodically assessed their situation with the tactical precision ingrained through years of military service. The cabin, once his sanctuary from the world, had become a potential trap. Its remote location, previously its greatest asset, now represented their most significant vulnerability. With roads impassable and movement through deep snow severely limited, their defensive options were concerningly few. Mason spread a topographical map across the kitchen table, tracing potential routes with a practiced eye, while Atlas watched attentively from his position near the wood stove. The injured Malinois had shown remarkable improvement in just 24 hours, his military resilience evident in the way he now moved about the cabin with greater confidence despite his splintered leg. 3 possible evacuation routes, Mason explained, his voice breaking the evening silence. He had fallen into the habit of thinking aloud in Atlas's presence, finding unexpected clarity in articulating his thoughts to the attentive dog. The main Forest Service road is most direct, but also most obvious. The ridge trail offers better cover, but difficult terrain, especially with your injury. The creek path is longest, but provides natural concealment if we follow it downstream to the highway junction. Atlas tilted his head, dark eyes tracking Mason's finger as it moved across the map. The dog's focused attention created an almost uncanny impression of comprehension, as if he were actively participating in the strategic planning. Mason found himself responding to this apparent understanding, explaining his reasoning as he would to a human partner. "Whoever tracked you here will expect us to take the most direct route out," he continued, tapping the Forest Service road. "On the map, standard tactical approach would be to establish surveillance there, while maintaining mobile teams to respond if we attempt alternate routes." Mason paused, studying the contour lines that represented the challenging terrain surrounding his property. Every potential escape route presented significant obstacles: steep gradients, dense forest, water crossings, all made more treacherous by deep snow and freezing temperatures. Under optimal conditions, with proper equipment and an uninjured companion, Mason might have attempted the ridge trail. With an injured military dog and unknown pursuers, the risk calculation shifted dramatically. "We need time," Mason decided, speaking as much to himself as to Atlas. "Your leg needs to heal more before we attempt a lengthy journey on foot, and we need better intelligence on who's out there and what resources they have." Atlas stood carefully, limping to Mason's side and pressing his substantial weight gently against the man's leg, a gesture that somehow communicated both trust and readiness. Mason found himself automatically reaching down to stroke the dog's head, a movement that felt surprisingly natural despite his years of solitary existence. "First priority is perimeter security," Mason said, his mind transitioning from strategic planning to immediate tactical needs. "Then we prepare for contingencies." Moving with renewed purpose, Mason gathered essential supplies from throughout the cabin. Extra ammunition for his service weapon, high-calorie ration bars, water purification, tablets, medical supplies, cold-weather gear designed for maximum insulation with minimum bulk. Each item was carefully evaluated for necessity and packed in his weatherproof duffel. Atlas watched this preparation with evident interest, occasionally sniffing particular items, as if conducting his own inventory. When Mason packed a specially formulated protein bar designed for military working dogs, part of an emergency kit he'd maintained out of habit, Atlas's tail gave a single, knowing wag. "You recognize these, don't you?" Mason said, showing the specialized ration to the dog. "Standard issue for K9 units in forward operating bases." Guess some things don't change. The familiarity of tactical preparation settled Mason's thoughts, replacing anxiety with the focused calm he had relied upon during combat operations. This was terrain he understood, assessing threats, securing positions, planning contingencies. After years of attempting to escape his military identity, he now found himself drawing strength from its embedded patterns and disciplines. As darkness fell, Mason implemented basic security measures, establishing tripwires with attached aluminum cans around the cabin's perimeter, positioning battery-powered motion sensors at key approach points, creating improvised barriers to channel any potential intruders toward areas visible from the cabin windows. These preparations wouldn't stop a determined professional force, but would provide critical early warning of approach. Inside, Mason rearranged furniture to create defensive positions with clear fields of fire toward entry points. He established a secondary exit route through the rear window, partially concealed by the woodpile. Most importantly, he prepared a rapid escape cache, essential supplies, weapons, and navigation tools hidden in a weatherproof container 50 yards behind the cabin, accessible but not immediately visible to potential intruders. Throughout these preparations, Atlas remained alert and engaged, his military training evident in the way he positioned himself to maintain sightlines to potential entry points. Despite his injury, the dog displayed the heightened situational awareness characteristic of elite working dogs, responding to subtle sounds beyond human perception, tracking Mason's movements with understanding rather than confusion. By midnight, the immediate security improvements were complete. Mason allowed himself a brief meal of venison stew and hardtack, sharing portions with Atlas, who accepted the food with disciplined restraint despite his obvious hunger. The storm had passed completely, leaving an eerie silence broken only by occasional creaks of branches bearing the weight of accumulated snow. "Time for reconnaissance," Mason told Atlas, securing his thermal parka and checking the battery level on his night vision monocular. The dog immediately rose, moving toward the door with evident eagerness despite his injury. "No, you're staying here," Mason said firmly, using the command tone that military working dogs were trained to respect. "That leg needs rest, and you're our last line of defense if someone approaches while I'm out there." Atlas responded to the authoritative instruction with visible reluctance, but settled back into a vigilant position near the door, his posture communicating readiness despite the enforced rest. Mason calibrated the motion sensors to ignore the dog's movements within the cabin, then slipped outside into the crystalline night. The temperature had plummeted to well below zero, the cold so intense it burned in his lungs with each careful breath. Moonlight reflected off the snow-covered landscape, creating an ethereal illumination that rendered his night vision equipment almost unnecessary. Moving silently on snowshoes, Mason followed a circuitous route around his property, maintaining cover while searching for any sign of surveillance or intrusion. The mysterious boot prints he had observed earlier remained partially visible despite fresh snow, confirming his initial assessment. A single individual had circled the cabin, maintaining approximately 200 yards of distance, before departing along the Forest Service road. More concerning were the fresher impressions Mason discovered on the northwestern perimeter, subtle depressions suggesting someone had briefly established an observation position overlooking the cabin within the past few hours. Mason catalogued these findings without allowing emotional reaction to cloud his assessment. The evidence suggested professional surveillance, patient, methodical, and careful to avoid detection. Whoever was watching his cabin had military or specialized law enforcement training, operating with discipline rather than urgency. After completing his perimeter check, Mason expanded his reconnaissance to include the first quarter mile of each potential evacuation route. The Forest Service road showed clear signs of recent passage, not just the original tracks but newer impressions partially obscured by wind-blown snow. The ridge path and creek route remained untouched, suggesting the watchers were either unaware of these alternatives or had insufficient personnel to monitor all potential exits. Returning to the cabin after 90 minutes of careful observation, Mason entered to find Atlas exactly as he had left him, alert and vigilant beside the door, ears immediately swiveling to track Mason's entrance. The dog's discipline further confirmed his professional training, the ability to maintain position and focus for extended periods without supervision. "Good boy," Mason said quietly, removing his snow-encrusted outer gear and securing the door. "We've got company out there, just as we suspected." Atlas's soft whine seemed to acknowledge this assessment, his eyes tracking Mason's movements. As the man retrieved his satellite phone and composed a detailed text to Diane, the message contained his observations, assessment of surveillance patterns, and a request for any intelligence she might have gathered about potential hostiles. Mason kept the communication deliberately vague regarding his planned actions, aware that even secured communications could potentially be compromised. While awaiting Diane's response, Mason spread his map across the table once more, incorporating his reconnaissance findings into their evacuation options. The evidence of surveillance along the Forest Service road eliminated their most direct route. The untouched ridge and creek paths offered better security, but presented significant physical challenges for Atlas with his injured leg. Mason found himself unconsciously reaching for the dog as he contemplated these difficulties. Atlas leaned into his touch, the solid warmth of the Malinois providing unexpected reassurance. The responsibility of ensuring this remarkable animal's safety had awakened something in Mason that had lain dormant since his medical discharge, a sense of purpose, transcending mere survival. The satellite phone vibrated with Diane's response. The message, characteristically concise: confirmation on unauthorized K-9 program. 3 operators likely in your vicinity. Military backgrounds, private contractor status. Extreme caution advised. Extraction team available in 36 hours at coordinates attached. Authentication protocol to follow. The information confirmed Mason's worst suspicions while providing critical intelligence. 3 operators meant a standard tactical team, typically. 1 spotter, coordinator, and 2 field agents rotating surveillance and rest cycles. Their contractor status explained the operation's deniability while suggesting they operated with minimal oversight or restrictions. 36 hours, Mason told Atlas, who watched him with unwavering attention. We need to hold this position for a day and a half, then reach these coordinates for extraction. The attached location placed their rendezvous point approximately 12 miles from the cabin, a challenging journey through deep snow under normal circumstances, potentially grueling with an injured dog and hostile pursuers. The timeline created a narrow window, requiring precise execution, and Mason acknowledged silently significant luck. First light, we begin preparations for extended movement, Mason decided, checking his watch to find it approaching 0200 hours. You need rest to strengthen that leg, and I need a few hours of sleep to maintain effectiveness. Mason established a rotating rest schedule, 2 hours of sleep followed by 30 minutes of vigilant observation, repeated until morning. He positioned himself on the cabin floor beside Atlas, his back against the wall, with clear sightlines to all entry points, service weapon within immediate reach. As Mason settled into the first rest cycle, Atlas shifted positions slightly, pressing his warm body against the man's side in a gesture that seemed protective rather than seeking protection. The dog's steady breathing and alert posture created a peculiar sense of partnership that Mason had not experienced since his days with his Marine unit. The unspoken trust of 2 beings united by common purpose and shared danger. "We're getting out of this, Atlas," Mason murmured, allowing his hand to rest on the dog's shoulder. "Both of us." For the first time since retreating to his isolated cabin, Mason Reed felt the quiet stirring of something he had believed lost forever, not just purpose or duty, but the profound connection that comes from protecting something beyond oneself. Whatever danger awaited them in the coming days, they would face it together, each lending strength to the other in the ways they best understood. Dawn arrived with crystalline clarity, the rising sun transforming the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling panorama of prismatic light. Mason had maintained his vigilance throughout the night, adhering to the disciplined rest cycle that had sustained him through countless operations overseas. Atlas had matched his routine with military precision, remaining alert during Mason's rest periods and allowing himself brief moments of sleep when Mason stood watch. The first order of business was a thorough assessment of Atlas's condition. The splinted leg showed promising improvement. The swelling had decreased significantly, and the dog tolerated gentle manipulation with only minimal signs of discomfort. His overall demeanor had brightened considerably, the combination of proper nutrition, hydration, and rest beginning to restore his formidable physical presence. "You're healing faster than expected," Mason noted with approval, carefully rewrapping the leg with fresh bandaging. Military working dogs always were remarkably resilient. Atlas responded with a soft huff that almost resembled acknowledgement, maintaining perfect stillness during the treatment, despite obvious discomfort. His stoic patience reminded Mason of wounded Marines he had served with, men and women who endured pain without complaint, driven by duty and the knowledge that others depended on their recovery. After completing Atlas's treatment, Mason turned his attention to their evacuation preparations. The 12-mile journey to the extraction coordinates would require careful planning, particularly given Atlas's injury and the challenging terrain. While the dog's condition was improving, a trek of that distance through deep snow would place tremendous strain on his healing leg. Mason methodically assembled crucial equipment: specialized snow gear, emergency medical supplies, concentrated rations, navigation tools, communication devices, and defensive armaments. Each item was selected with careful consideration of weight, utility, and necessity. In combat zones, Mason had learned that survival often depended on finding the perfect balance between preparedness and mobility. "We need something to protect your paws," Mason told Atlas, examining the dog's feet with critical attention. The Malinois pads showed signs of previous injuries, healed lacerations, and calluses that spoke of harsh conditions endured over time. "Extended exposure to snow and ice will cause damage, especially given your weakened condition." From his emergency supplies, Mason retrieved a set of specially designed canine booties, durable, waterproof coverings intended to protect military working dogs during extreme weather operations. Atlas recognized the equipment immediately, lifting each paw in turn to facilitate their application without being prompted. The practiced cooperation revealed another fragment of the dog's professional history. He had clearly performed cold weather operations requiring such protection. "You've done this before," Mason observed, securing the final bootie with its Velcro fastener. "Somewhere cold, northern Afghanistan maybe, or specialized training in Alaska." Atlas offered no confirmation beyond his evident familiarity with the equipment, but Mason found himself constructing a mental timeline of the dog's service history. If Atlas had been deployed during the Kandahar incident in 2019, he would have already completed basic and specialized training, suggesting at least a year of prior service. The intervening years remained mysterious. The period between his supposed death in Afghanistan and his appearance on Mason's porch represented a significant gap in his history. Mason's tactical assessment was interrupted by a subtle change in Atlas's demeanor. The dog's ears shifted forward, his body tensing slightly as he oriented toward the cabin's northern window. A moment later, Mason heard it too, the faint but unmistakable sound of an approaching snowmobile. Moving with practiced efficiency, Mason secured his sidearm and positioned himself adjacent to the window, angling for visibility while minimizing his exposure. Atlas took up a complementary position on the opposite side, his posture communicating readiness despite his injury. The synchronicity of their movements required no instruction or prior planning. Each instinctively understood tactical positioning and sightlines. The sound grew louder, eventually resolving into a single snowmobile approaching via the Forest Service road. Through his binoculars, Mason identified the distinctive green uniform of the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, a conservation officer making rounds after the storm. "Stand down," Mason told Atlas, whose alert posture had not relaxed. Despite Mason's reduced vigilance, this is expected. DNR checks remote cabins after major storms. Atlas shifted his weight, but maintained his attentive stance, clearly processing Mason's words against his own assessment of the approaching visitor. The dog's caution reflected his training. Trust but verify, particularly in situations involving unknown individuals approaching a secured position. The conservation officer maneuvered her snowmobile into the small clearing before the cabin, cutting the engine and removing her helmet to reveal a woman in her early 30s with auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid. Officer Elena Gonzalez had been patrolling this section of the Upper Peninsula for 3 years, and her occasional check-ins represented Mason's most consistent human contact during his self-imposed isolation. Mason opened the door as she approached, noting her expression of mild surprise at not having to knock. He typically waited for her explicit announcement before acknowledging her presence. "Mr. Reed," she greeted him with professional courtesy. "Just checking on residents after the storm. Everyone in this sector okay?" "I'm fine, Officer Gonzalez," Mason replied, careful to maintain his usual reserved demeanor despite the extraordinary circumstances inside his cabin. "Roads still impassable to standard vehicles?" "At least another day before county plows reach. These access roads," she confirmed, stamping snow from her boots. "Main highways are cleared, but—" Her sentence cut off abruptly as Atlas appeared in the doorway beside Mason, his imposing presence drawing her immediate attention. Officer Gonzalez's hand instinctively moved toward her sidearm before Mason's. Calm voice interrupted the motion. "He's friendly," Mason assured her quickly, "a stray that found his way to my porch during the storm." Officer Gonzalez relaxed slightly, but maintained a professional alertness as she assessed the unusual situation. "That's no ordinary stray, Mr. Reed. That's a Belgian Malinois, and unless I miss my guess, one with professional training." Mason had anticipated this recognition. DNR officers received basic training in identifying various working dogs, particularly those used in law enforcement. Atlas's distinctive breed and obvious discipline would immediately signal his professional background to anyone with relevant knowledge. "Found him half frozen on my porch," Mason explained, offering a partial truth that would seem plausible while withholding the more complex reality. "He's injured but recovering. I've called the vet in Marquette, planning to bring him in when the road's clear." Officer Gonzalez studied Atlas with increased interest, her gaze lingering on his splintered leg and the tactical booties. "Those are specialized equipment," she observed, "not something you'd typically have on hand for a random stray." The observation was precise and perceptive, exactly the kind of detail that made Elena Gonzalez effective in her role. Mason had always appreciated her thoroughness during their limited interactions, but now found himself calculating how to address her justified curiosity without revealing too much. "Military habit," he said simply, gesturing to the booty. "Always. kept emergency supplies for various contingencies. These were part of my cold weather kit. Officer Gonzalez nodded slowly, her expression suggesting partial acceptance of this explanation, while reserving judgment on aspects that didn't fully align. Her next words confirmed Mason's assessment of her perceptiveness. "Interesting coincidence," she remarked casually, finding a military-grade working dog during a blizzard in one of the most remote cabins in my patrol area. Mason maintained neutral eye contact, neither confirming her implicit question nor offering defensive denial. Atlas, seeming to sense the delicate nature of the interaction, had settled into a calm sitting position that nonetheless conveyed alert vigilance. "I've seen unusual tracks around several properties in this area since the storm passed," Officer Gonzalez continued, her tone conversational, but her eyes sharp with professional assessment. "Boot prints that don't match any of our regular residents. People who have legitimate business in these woods during winter storms are limited." The information presented Mason with an immediate tactical decision. Officer Gonzalez had clearly observed signs of the surveillance team monitoring his cabin, evidence that supported Diane's intelligence about 3 operators in the vicinity. This observation presented both risk and opportunity. If Gonzalez investigated further, she might inadvertently alert the surveillance team to her awareness, or worse, place herself in danger from operators likely to consider her a complication to their mission. Conversely, a DNR officer represented potential assistance from someone with legitimate authority, local knowledge, and communications capabilities that could prove invaluable during their evacuation. The question was whether Mason could trust Officer Gonzalez with a partial truth that would secure her assistance without placing her in unnecessary danger. Atlas made the decision for him. The Malinois rose smoothly and approached Officer Gonzalez, his movement displaying none of the caution he had shown with Mason initially. Instead, he presented himself for inspection with the confident demeanor of a working dog interacting with a recognized authority figure. The behavior suggested Atlas had previous positive experiences with law enforcement personnel. Officer Gonzalez responded with appropriate protocol, allowing Atlas to sniff her hand before carefully examining his physical condition with practiced movements that demonstrated familiarity with handling working dogs. "His muscle tone and behavior indicate professional training," she concluded, "and these old scars aren't from wilderness survival. This dog has seen combat." Mason recognized the moment required a calculated risk. "You have specialized canine training in your background," he observed, not a question, but a confirmation of what Atlas had already apparently determined. 2 years with Border Patrol K9 unit before transferring to DNR, she acknowledged, her attention still primarily on Atlas. "Worked with Belgian Malinois similar to this one." She looked up, meeting Mason's gaze directly. "So we both know this isn't a random stray, Mr. Reed. The question is why you're pretending he is." The directness of her challenge demanded equivalent. Honesty. Mason made his decision, balancing operational security against practical necessity. "What I'm about to tell you could potentially place you in a complicated position, Officer Gonzalez. Before I continue, I need to know if you're willing to accept that risk." To her credit, Officer Gonzalez didn't respond immediately. She considered the statement with appropriate seriousness, her gaze moving between Mason, Atlas, and the cabin's interior visible behind them. After a measured silence, she nodded once, decisively. "Those tracks I mentioned concern me," she said. "They don't match any legitimate activity pattern I recognize. If there's something happening in my patrol area that potentially threatens residents, I need to know about it." Mason gestured for her to enter the cabin, closing the door securely behind her. Atlas positioned himself near the window, resuming. his vigilant watch of the approaches, while Mason provided Officer Gonzalez with a carefully edited version of the situation. Atlas's appearance during the storm, evidence of his military background, signs of surveillance around the cabin, and the need to transport the dog to a secure location once the roads cleared. He omitted specific details about Diane's intelligence regarding the unauthorized K9 program and the extraction team, presenting the situation as a matter of ensuring a valuable military working dog received proper care and was returned to appropriate authorities. This partial disclosure provided Officer Gonzalez with sufficient information to understand the seriousness of the situation without compromising operational security or placing her in the ethical dilemma of knowingly participating in an intelligence operation. "So you believe whoever abandoned this dog is now trying to recover him," Officer Gonzalez summarized, her expression thoughtful. "And based on their surveillance methods, they're not acting in an official capacity." "That's my assessment," Mason confirmed, impressed by her quick grasp of the essential elements. "My immediate concern is reaching Marquette once the roads are passable." Officer Gonzalez considered this information with professional thoroughness, absently running her hand along Atlas's back as the dog had settled beside her chair during their conversation. The Malinois leaned slightly into her touch, his body language communicating a level of trust that further confirmed her background with similar working dogs. "The main road should be cleared by tomorrow morning," she said finally. "But if these individuals are monitoring your cabin, they'll know as soon as you attempt to leave. One vehicle on these back roads is easy to intercept." The tactical assessment aligned perfectly with Mason's own concerns. A single vehicle on a predictable route presented an ideal interdiction opportunity for a trained team with local knowledge and appropriate resources. "I can provide assistance," Officer Gonzalez offered, her decision apparently made. "Tomorrow morning I'll return with the department snowmobile trailer. We'll transport you and Atlas to the main highway under official DNR escort. Anyone attempting to interfere with a conservation officer conducting official business would attract immediate attention from multiple agencies." The proposal presented an elegant solution to their immediate evacuation challenge. DNR vehicles, moving through remote areas after storms, represented normal activity patterns that wouldn't trigger immediate suspicion. An official escort would significantly complicate any interdiction attempt by the surveillance team. "That would be extremely helpful," Mason acknowledged, carefully maintaining the fiction that his destination was simply the veterinary clinic in Marquette rather than the extraction coordinates Diane had provided. "Do 800 tomorrow," Officer Gonzalez confirmed, rising to leave. "Have Atlas ready for transport. I'll bring appropriate equipment to secure him safely during transit." As she prepared to depart, she paused at the door, her expression shifting from professional to something more personal. "Mr. Reed, in 3 years of welfare checks, this is the first time I've seen you actually engaged with something beyond mere existence. Whatever brought this dog to your door, it seems to have awakened something important." Before Mason could formulate a response to this unexpected observation, Officer Gonzalez had departed, the sound of her snowmobile fading into the distance. Atlas returned to Mason's side, their shoulders almost touching as they stood in the doorway watching the small figure disappear into the white landscape. "Tactical advantage secured," Mason told Atlas quietly, "but also a new variable in the equation." The question of whether Officer Gonzalez's involvement represented an acceptable risk or an operational vulnerability remained unresolved. Yet Mason found himself experiencing something unfamiliar after her departure, a tentative optimism that their chances of reaching the extraction point had meaningfully improved. The remainder of the day passed with methodical preparation. Mason's Military training had instilled in him the understanding that success often hinged on meticulous planning rather than spontaneous heroics. Every contingency required consideration. Every piece of equipment demanded inspection, and every potential scenario needed a corresponding response strategy. Atlas seemed to understand the gravity of their situation, maintaining vigilant watch near the windows when not resting his injured leg. The dog's condition continued to improve remarkably, his movement growing steadier, his gaze more alert, his overall demeanor increasingly reminiscent of the elite military working dog he had once been. Mason found himself impressed by the Malinois' resilience, the speed with which his professional instincts had reasserted themselves, despite whatever hardships he had endured. "Your recovery rate is exceptional," Mason commented as he checked the splint one final time before their departure. "Most beings wouldn't bounce back so quickly from what you've been through." Atlas responded with the focused attention he gave. To all of Mason's words, his intelligent eyes tracking every movement as the man prepared their essential supplies. The connection between them had deepened into something that transcended the conventional relationship between human and dog. They had become partners in a shared mission, each contributing their unique capabilities toward their mutual survival. As evening approached, Mason sent a carefully worded update to Diane via satellite phone, informing her of their transportation arrangement with Officer Gonzalez and their expected arrival time at the extraction coordinates. Her response came swiftly: "Authentication confirmation. Team will identify as Timber Resources Survey. Countersign, the watershed needs assessment. Destroy this message." Mason deleted the communication immediately, committing the authentication. Phrases to memory. Such protocols were standard in sensitive operations, providing a secure method of identifying friendly personnel without explicit documentation that could be compromised. The precision of Diane's arrangements confirmed his impression that she had maintained significant operational connections despite her transition to civilian status. After completing final preparations, Mason allowed himself the luxury of a hot meal, perhaps their last opportunity for proper nutrition before the challenging journey ahead. He prepared a simple but calorie-dense stew of preserved venison, root vegetables, and barley, sharing a generous portion with Atlas. The dog consumed his meal with disciplined efficiency, neither rushing greedily nor hesitating despite obvious hunger, another indication of his professional training. "Tomorrow will test both of us," Mason told Atlas as they finished eating. "Your leg is improving but still vulnerable. The journey will place significant strain on it, and we can't guarantee uninterrupted rest once we're mobile." Atlas seemed to process this assessment with remarkable comprehension, shifting his weight experimentally on the injured limb as if testing its capacity. The gesture struck Mason as almost human in its deliberate self-evaluation. The dog was clearly preparing himself mentally for the challenges ahead. Mason conducted a final security sweep as darkness fell, checking tripwires and motion sensors, while assessing the landscape for any sign of surveillance activity. The perimeter remained secure, with no fresh tracks visible in the undisturbed snow surrounding the cabin. This absence of immediate threat could indicate either a temporary withdrawal of the surveillance team or, more concerningly, a shift to more sophisticated observation methods beyond Mason's detection capabilities. Either possibility necessitated maintaining full alertness through the night. Mason established the same rotating rest schedule they had followed previously, allowing each of them sufficient recovery time while ensuring continuous vigilance. Atlas adapted seamlessly to this routine, assuming watch duty during Mason's rest, periods with the focused attention characteristic of elite working dogs. During his own watch cycles, Mason found himself reflecting on Officer Gonzalez's parting observation, that Atlas's arrival had awakened something previously dormant within him. The comment had penetrated more deeply than he had initially acknowledged, forcing recognition of how profoundly his existence had contracted since leaving the service. What had begun as temporary withdrawal to process his injuries and experiences had gradually calcified into permanent isolation. The disciplined routines that had once sustained him through combat deployments had become empty rituals, maintaining physical survival while allowing his deeper sense of purpose and connection to atrophy. Atlas's unexpected appearance had disrupted this stagnation, demanding engagement with something beyond mere existence. The realization brought neither comfort nor distress, simply clarity, a recognition that the path forward led somewhere beyond. The confines he had established for himself, whether this represented progress or merely another form of adaptation, remained uncertain, but the crystalline stillness of the winter night seemed conducive to such honest self-assessment. Dawn arrived with perfect clarity, the eastern sky gradually illuminating with bands of orange and gold that transformed the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling panorama. Mason moved through final preparations with heightened focus, securing essential supplies in a specialized backpack designed for tactical mobility, while minimizing Atlas's equipment to the protective booties and a lightweight harness that could assist the dog if his injured leg faltered during their journey. Officer Gonzalez arrived precisely at 800 hours, her DNR snowmobile pulling a covered transport trailer designed for equipment and wildlife. She operated with impressive efficiency, helping Mason secure their gear while preparing a comfortable compartment for Atlas in the trailer. "I brought proper canine transport equipment," she explained, showing Mason the specialized padding and security harness she had arranged. "This will stabilize him during transit and minimize stress on his injured leg." Atlas entered the transport compartment without hesitation, settling into the secured position with the calm compliance of a dog accustomed to various transportation methods. His trust in Officer Gonzalez appeared complete, further confirming her background with similar working dogs. "I've reported a potential wildlife poaching situation near the Eastern Ridge," she informed Mason as they completed final preparations. "Standard procedure requires me to investigate with appropriate departmental resources. Your presence is documented as a local resident assisting with site identification." The cover story was elegant in its simplicity, a routine conservation activity that justified their movement through remote areas without attracting undue attention. Mason appreciated Officer Gonzalez's thoroughness in establishing official documentation for their journey, creating a legitimate operational framework that would withstand casual scrutiny. 2 snowmobiles were observed near the Carson Junction. "Turn off yesterday," she continued, her tone professionally neutral, though her eyes conveyed more significant meaning. "Non-standard equipment. Operators maintaining stationary position for extended periods without apparent recreational or professional purpose." The information confirmed Mason's assessment of ongoing surveillance. Carson Junction represented the primary intersection between the Forest Service road from his cabin and the main highway, an ideal position for monitoring the only conventional exit route from his property. "Our route bypasses that junction completely," Officer Gonzalez assured him, gesturing toward the northwestern trail leading from his property. "We'll use the Conservation Service paths through the Whitefish Creek watershed, longer distance but minimal chance of unexpected encounters." Mason nodded his appreciation for her tactical adjustment, recognizing the value of local knowledge in evading potential interception. The alternative route would indeed extend their journey time, but significantly reduce the risk of confrontation. With the surveillance team, with final preparations complete, Mason secured the cabin, not with the expectation of returning soon, but from ingrained habit and respect for the shelter that had served him faithfully during his years of isolation. He placed his hand momentarily on the weathered doorframe, acknowledging the significance of this departure without allowing sentiment to interfere with necessary action. Officer Gonzalez observed this brief gesture with quiet understanding, offering no comment as Mason mounted the second snowmobile and activated its engine. Atlas, secured in the transport compartment with clear visibility through plexiglass panels, maintained alert attention to their surroundings as they began their journey away from the only stable environment he had known since his dramatic appearance. During the blizzard, the snowmobiles moved smoothly through the pristine landscape, following a narrow trail that wound between towering pines laden with snow. Officer Gonzalez led with confident navigation, maintaining a pace that balanced efficient progress with careful attention to terrain challenges. Mason followed precisely in her track, the familiar discipline of convoy movement returning with automatic precision. The first hour passed without incident, their route carrying them deeper into the conservation area, while maintaining significant distance from public trails and access roads. The day had warmed slightly, the temperature rising just enough to create occasional falls of snow from overburdened branches, each sudden movement triggering momentary alertness until identified as natural rather than potential threat. During a brief pause to check Atlas's condition and adjust their equipment, Officer Gonzalez consulted her GPS unit with focused attention. "We're making good time," she reported. "Another hour to the Northern Fire Road, then approximately 90 minutes. To the highway junction. State plows have cleared that section as of 0600 this morning." Mason nodded acknowledgement while checking Atlas through the transport compartment's access panel. The Malinois appeared comfortable, despite the journey's vibration and cold, his attention alternating between scanning their surroundings and maintaining visual contact with Mason. His injured leg remained properly positioned on the specialized padding Officer Gonzalez had provided, minimizing stress during transit. "He's handling the journey well," Mason noted, offering Atlas a brief stroke along his neck before securing the access panel. Military working dogs are trained for various transportation methods: helicopters, transport vehicles, even parachute insertions in some specialized units. This is relatively comfortable by comparison. Officer Gonzalez smiled slightly, her professional reserve softening momentarily. "He's extraordinary," she acknowledged. "Most injured animals show significant stress during transport. His trust in you is evident." The observation prompted Mason to consider the remarkable speed with which Atlas had formed a connection with him, a bond established in less than 48 hours that nonetheless demonstrated profound trust and cooperation. Whether this represented the dog's exceptional adaptability or some deeper recognition between two beings shaped by similar experiences remained unclear, but the reality of their partnership was undeniable. As they prepared to resume their journey, a subtle shift in Atlas's demeanor caught Mason's attention. The dog's ears had pivoted sharply, his body tensing within the security harness as his focus locked on something beyond Mason's perception. Years of combat experience had taught Mason to trust such warnings implicitly. Military working dogs often detected threats beyond human sensory capabilities. "Hold," Mason said quietly to Officer Gonzalez, who had already noticed the change in Atlas and paused with her hand on the snowmobile's ignition. "Something's wrong." They remained motionless, scanning their surroundings with heightened vigilance. The forest appeared peaceful, winter stillness interrupted only by occasional bird calls and the soft whisper of wind through pine boughs. Yet Atlas maintained his alert posture, his attention fixed on the dense tree line to their northeast. The sound reached them moments later, the distant but distinctive rumble of snowmobile engines, at least two separate vehicles moving at high speed. The approaching machines were still beyond visual range, but clearly traveling with purpose rather than the casual pace of recreational riders. "That's not DNR or local traffic," Officer Gonzalez stated with certainty. Conservation staff are all assigned to southern sectors today, and locals rarely use these service trails. The tactical situation shifted instantly from routine transit to potential confrontation. Mason assessed their options with combat-honed clarity, calculating distances, terrain advantages, and response scenarios. Their position offered minimal defensive cover, an open stretch of trail bordered by widely spaced pines that provided limited concealment but no effective protection from determined pursuit. "Two choices," Mason said, his voice calm despite the surge of adrenaline. "Attempt to outrun them using your local knowledge of these trails, or establish a defensive position at the next viable location." Officer Gonzalez made her decision without hesitation, the speed of her response reflecting her own professional training. "Evasion is our best option. There's a maintenance shed 2 kilometers ahead with radio communication equipment and secure structure. We can reach it before they intercept our current position." Mason nodded agreement, recognizing the wisdom of leveraging her territorial knowledge rather than attempting a confrontation with unknown adversaries. "Lead out, maximum safe speed. I'll secure the rear position." They resumed their journey. With new urgency, Officer Gonzalez setting a faster pace while maintaining necessary caution on the winding trail. Mason followed precisely in her track, dividing his attention between their forward movement and periodic checks of their rear approach. Atlas remained vigilant in his transport compartment, his posture communicating continued alertness to the approaching threat. The distant engine sounds grew gradually louder, confirming their pursuers were indeed closing the distance despite their accelerated pace. The tactical disadvantage became increasingly apparent. Their heavily laden snowmobiles, particularly with Atlas's transport trailer, couldn't match the speed of pursuit vehicles likely optimized for performance rather than utility. The first visual confirmation came as they navigated a slight rise in the trail, a momentary glimpse of 2 black snowmobiles approximately half a kilometer behind them, the riders wearing matching white cold-weather gear that provided near-perfect camouflage against the snow-covered landscape. Their coordinated movement and precise positioning on the trail confirmed Mason's assessment. These were professionally trained operators executing a practiced intercept pattern. The revelation transformed their journey from desperate flight to tactical engagement. Mason's mind shifted automatically into combat assessment mode, calculating angles, distances, and response options with mechanical precision. The pursuing team had managed to locate them despite their alternative route, suggesting either sophisticated tracking capabilities or comprehensive surveillance coverage of the entire area surrounding his cabin. Either possibility indicated resources and determination beyond what Mason had initially estimated. These weren't simply private contractors attempting to recover escaped property. They represented a professional retrieval team with military-grade capabilities and apparent authorization to operate openly on American soil. The implications were disturbing on multiple levels, but immediate survival took precedence over broader concerns. As they approached a sharp bend in the trail, Mason made a split-second decision based on years of combat experience. Rather than following Officer Gonzalez around the curve, he abruptly cut his snowmobile into the deeper snow beside the trail, powering through the resistance until he reached the shelter of several large pines, approximately 20 meters from the established path. From this concealed position, he would have clear sight lines to the pursuing vehicles as they rounded the bend, creating a brief opportunity for decisive action before they realized the full tactical situation. It was a maneuver born of combat, necessity rather than civilian caution, a recognition that sometimes survival required confrontation rather than continued flight. As Officer Gonzalez disappeared around the bend, Mason positioned himself and waited, one hand on his concealed, Sidearm, the other maintaining his snowmobile's ignition for immediate mobility if required. Atlas remained absolutely silent in his transport compartment, his military training evident in his perfect stillness despite the heightened tension. The pursuers appeared moments later, moving with professional precision as they navigated the curve in the trail. Their white tactical gear now revealed subtle details, standardized design, multiple equipment attachments, communication devices integrated into their helmets. Not private security or law enforcement, but something with far more specialized training and purpose. Mason took a deep breath, centering himself as he had done countless times before critical engagements. Whatever came next would determine not just his fate, but Atlas's chance for freedom from whatever shadowy program had attempted to erase his existence. The moment of decision had arrived sooner than expected, but Mason Reed had never been one to retreat from necessary confrontation, especially when protecting those under his care. As the pursuers rounded the bend, Mason remained perfectly still, allowing the natural camouflage of the pine trees to obscure his position. Years of combat experience had taught him the value of patience. Acting prematurely would reveal his location and eliminate the element of surprise, while waiting for the perfect moment could transform a disadvantageous situation into a tactical opportunity. The two operators maintained professional formation as they followed the trail, one slightly ahead and to the left, the other maintaining a rear-right position that provided optimal coverage of all approaches. Their movements displayed the fluid coordination that comes only through extensive training and shared operational experience. These were not ordinary security contractors, but specialized personnel accustomed to working as a synchronized unit. Mason noticed something that confirmed his suspicions about their mission. The lead operator carried a specialized equipment case secured to his snowmobile, a distinctive rectangular container with reinforced corners and environmental sealing that Mason recognized from his military service. It was a transport unit designed specifically for K9 equipment. Tactical harnesses, medical supplies, and essential gear for handling military working dogs in field operations. They weren't just pursuing Atlas. They had come fully prepared to recapture and transport him. This observation provided critical intelligence. These operators expected to retrieve Atlas intact, suggesting their primary mission parameters likely prohibited lethal force against the dog. This operational constraint might provide a critical advantage if properly leveraged. Mason allowed the pursuers to pass his position, counting silently as they continued around the curve, following Officer Gonzalez's trail. Once they had cleared his sightline, he reactivated his snowmobile and accelerated onto the trail behind them, deliberately positioning himself to eliminate their rear security coverage. The tactical calculation was precise. By placing himself between the two teams, he could create confusion and force them to divide their attention. The operators recognized the new threat immediately, the rear snowmobile abruptly slowing as the rider registered Mason's presence behind them. Through the operator's helmet visor, Mason caught a glimpse of surprise, followed by rapid tactical assessment. The momentary widening of eyes and subsequent narrowing that indicated recognition of a compromised position. Rather than allowing the operator time to communicate with his partner or establish a defensive posture, Mason accelerated directly toward him, closing the distance with controlled aggression. The operator reacted with professional composure, reaching toward what Mason recognized as a concealed holster beneath his tactical jacket. Before the operator could complete the movement, Mason executed a maneuver he had perfected during specialized snowmobile training for Arctic deployments. A controlled lateral slide that brought his vehicle perpendicular to the trail while maintaining forward momentum. The technique created an unavoidable obstruction for the pursuing snowmobile, forcing the operator to choose between collision or evasive action. The operator chose evasion, veering sharply off the trail into deeper snow that immediately reduced his mobility. Mason used this momentary advantage to bring his snowmobile alongside the struggling vehicle, maintaining the perfect distance for his next action. With practiced precision, Mason extended his leg in a sweeping motion that caught the operator's shoulder, disrupting his balance at a crucial moment of instability. The combination of deep snow, compromised balance, and unexpected physical contact proved too much for even professional compensation. The operator lost control, his snowmobile tipping sideways and partially burying itself in a snowdrift. Mason didn't slow to confirm the operator's status, knowing that immobilizing one threat simply allowed him to address the more significant danger ahead. The lead operator had now become aware of the confrontation behind him, the distinctive sound of his partner's snowmobile engine stalling, reaching him despite the distance. At the next bend in the trail, Mason caught sight of a tactical scenario in progress. Officer Gonzalez had stopped her snowmobile across the trail, positioning herself with her service weapon drawn and her DNR vehicle providing partial cover. The lead operator had halted approximately 30 meters from her position, creating a standoff situation with neither side holding decisive advantage. Mason assessed the situation instantly, recognizing both the danger and opportunity it presented. By inserting himself into this confrontation, he could potentially create the distraction Officer Gonzalez needed to gain tactical superiority, but doing so required precise timing and execution. The lead operator remained focused on Officer Gonzalez, apparently unaware that his partner had been neutralized and that Mason was rapidly approaching his position from behind. This information asymmetry created a critical advantage that would dissipate within seconds once the operator processed the changing tactical situation. Mason made his decision, accelerating toward the confrontation while angling his snowmobile to provide maximum protection for Atlas's transport compartment. As he closed the distance, he could hear the operator's demand carrying across the snow-covered landscape. "Department of Natural Resources officer, this is a federal security matter," the operator called, his voice carrying professional authority despite the tension in the situation. "Stand down immediately and surrender the military asset in your custody." Officer Gonzalez maintained her position, her response clear and equally authoritative. "Identify yourself and present proper documentation. I observe no federal insignia, vehicles, or identification. Until properly verified, this remains a DNR jurisdiction matter." The exchange confirmed what Mason had suspected. These operators were functioning with some level of governmental authorization, but without official transparency. Their operational parameters existed in the shadowy territory between legitimate authority and deniable activity, allowing them to make claims of federal jurisdiction without providing standard identification or following established protocols. This legal ambiguity worked to Mason and Officer Gonzalez's advantage. As a uniformed conservation officer conducting documented official activities, Gonzalez occupied a position of clear legal authority that the operators could not easily override without exposing the unauthorized nature of their operation. Mason brought his snowmobile to a controlled stop approximately 15 meters behind the lead operator, positioning his vehicle at an angle that provided both coverage for Atlas and clear fields of fire if the situation deteriorated further. The operator registered his arrival instantly, his posture stiffening as he realized the tactical disadvantage of being caught between two opponents. "Your partner has been temporarily incapacitated," Mason stated clearly, projecting his voice. "With the command presence developed through years of military leadership, you're now in a compromised tactical position with no extraction support. Consider your options carefully." The operator maintained remarkable composure despite this development. neither panicking nor making impulsive movements. Instead, he performed a methodical assessment of his situation, calculating angles and distances with professional precision before responding. "This doesn't need to escalate further," the operator replied, his voice steady and controlled. "The asset you're transporting is federal property involved in a classified program. Its recovery is a matter of national security. Compliance now ensures no charges will be filed regarding your interference." The phrasing was revealing. The operator referred to Atlas as it and asset, rather than using standard terminology for military working dogs. This dehumanizing language confirmed Mason's suspicions about the nature of the program Atlas had escaped from, one that viewed these highly trained animals as equipment rather than valued service members. "That asset has a name, a service, record and protected status under military regulations regarding working dogs," Mason countered, strategically revealing his knowledge of proper protocols. Atlas was listed as killed in action in Afghanistan. Any program operating with him afterward did so by falsifying official records, a federal offense. The operator's slight hesitation confirmed the accuracy of Mason's statement. This confrontation had evolved beyond simple asset recovery into potential exposure of unauthorized activities, a complication the operator had clearly not anticipated when pursuing what appeared to be a straightforward retrieval mission. Officer Gonzalez seized the momentary advantage created by this exchange. "I'm documenting this entire interaction," she stated, gesturing subtly toward the body camera secured to her uniform. "As the ranking law enforcement officer present, I'm requiring you to produce identification and authorization documents immediately." The combined pressure created an untenable situation for the operator. Standard operational security protocols would prohibit carrying documentation that connected him directly to classified activities. Yet without such documentation, his authority to demand surrender of Atlas could not be legitimately established. Mason observed these calculations reflected in the operator's body language, the subtle shift in weight, the minute adjustments in posture that indicated internal conflict between mission objectives and tactical realities. These were the telltale signs of someone re-evaluating operational parameters in real time. Atlas, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, now issued a soft but distinct growl from within his transport compartment, the first aggressive sound he had made in Mason's presence. The vocalization carried precise meaning to those familiar with military working dogs, recognition of a threat and readiness to engage if necessary. The operator responded to this sound with a barely perceptible flinch, a reaction that revealed something significant about his relationship with Atlas. This wasn't the startled response of someone unfamiliar with working dogs, but the specific tension of someone who had previous negative experiences with this particular animal. "You know him," Mason observed quietly, the realization crystallizing, "and he remembers you." The statement hung in the frigid air between them, transforming the standoff from a procedural confrontation into something more personal. Whatever connection existed between this operator and Atlas carried emotional weight that complicated the already tense situation. Officer Gonzalez maintained her authoritative stance, using the momentary distraction to adjust her position slightly, improving both her coverage and her sightlines to the forest behind them, where the second operator might eventually appear. "Final warning," she stated firmly. "Identify yourself properly, or I will place you under arrest for obstruction of a conservation officer in the performance of official duties." The operator's response was interrupted by the distant sound of approaching vehicles, the distinctive engine signature of heavy-duty trucks navigating the Forest Service road that intersected with their trail approximately half a kilometer ahead. The unexpected development shifted the tactical calculation dramatically, introducing unknown variables into an already complex situation. Mason recognized the critical moment had arrived. Whatever decision the operator made in the next few seconds would determine whether this confrontation ended with peaceful resolution or escalated into something far more dangerous. His military experience had taught him that offering an adversary a viable exit strategy often proved more effective than forcing them into a corner where desperation might override rational judgment. "Your extraction window is closing," Mason said, his tone shifting from confrontational to pragmatic. "New variables are approaching, and your partner requires assistance. Whatever your mission parameters, the tactical situation has become untenable. There are better options than continuing this engagement." The operator remained silent for several seconds, weighing alternatives with professional detachment. Mason could almost see the mental calculations, the assessment of mission objectives against operational realities, the consideration of acceptable losses versus potential exposure, the evaluation of multiple contingency plans against rapidly changing circumstances. Finally, the operator made his decision, slowly raising one hand in a gesture that acknowledged the altered tactical landscape. "This recovery operation is temporarily suspended," he stated with controlled precision. "But understand that this situation remains unresolved. The asset has significant value beyond your current understanding." Without waiting for response, the operator smoothly activated his snowmobile and executed a precise turn that carried him off the established trail and into the forest, following a route that would bypass their position while allowing him to retrieve his incapacitated partner. The maneuver displayed exceptional skill and situational awareness, hallmarks of advanced operational training. As the sound of the operator's snowmobile faded into the distance, Officer Gonzalez maintained her vigilant posture until confident the immediate threat had passed. Only then did she lower her weapon and approach Mason's position, her expression reflecting both relief and concern. "That was no ordinary security contractor," she observed, her gaze following the direction of the operator's departure. "His tactical behavior and communication patterns suggest specialized training well beyond standard federal agents." Mason nodded agreement, already calculating the implications of this encounter for their continued journey. "They've temporarily withdrawn, not abandoned their objective. We need to reach the extraction point before they can reorganize or call in additional resources." Officer Gonzalez's questioning look prompted Mason to reconsider his phrasing. "The veterinary clinic," he amended, maintaining the cover story established earlier. "We need to get Atlas proper medical attention before those individuals make another attempt to interfere." She accepted this explanation with professional grace, though her expression suggested she recognized the statement as partial truth rather than complete disclosure. "The approaching vehicles are likely the Forestry Service maintenance crew," she noted, checking her watch. "They're scheduled to assess storm damage along the northern sector today." The coincidental timing of the forestry crew's approach had provided a critical advantage during their confrontation, introducing uncertainty that contributed to the operator's decision to withdraw rather than escalate. Mason filed this information away as another example of how seemingly random circumstances often influence tactical outcomes as significantly as planned strategies. Atlas had remained remarkably composed throughout the entire confrontation, his behavior reflecting the exceptional training and temperament characteristic of elite military working dogs. Now, as Mason checked his condition through the transport compartment's access panel, the Malinois met his gaze with unwavering focus and apparent understanding of the situation's gravity. "You did well, Atlas," Mason told him quietly, allowing himself a moment of genuine connection despite the operational pressures surrounding them. "We're continuing to the secure location as planned." The dog's response was subtle but unmistakable, a slight relaxation of his posture, a softening around the eyes that communicated trust and commitment to their shared purpose. This wordless exchange carried deeper significance than any tactical planning or strategic assessment. In that moment, Mason recognized that their partnership had evolved beyond circumstantial alliance into something more meaningful, a bond forged through shared danger and mutual protection. Officer Gonzalez, observing this interaction with thoughtful attention, offered no comment, but her expression reflected understanding of its significance. "We should move immediately," she suggested, already returning to her snowmobile. "Different route than originally planned. If they're monitoring standard trails, we'll use the watershed maintenance paths. More challenging terrain, but minimal chance of interception." As they prepared to resume their journey, Mason sent a brief, coded update to Diane via satellite phone, alerting her to the confrontation and the likelihood that the operators would attempt to monitor potential extraction routes. Her response came immediately. Extraction point shifted to secondary location. New coordinates transmitted, increased security presence established. The tactical adjustments reflected the professional thoroughness Mason had expected from Diane's team. With the original extraction plan potentially compromised, they had seamlessly transitioned to predetermined contingencies, adapting to evolving circumstances while maintaining operational security. Mason shared the updated coordinates with Officer Gonzalez, who quickly recalculated their route to accommodate the new destination. "That's actually better," she noted, studying her GPS unit. "Less exposed approach, more consistent DNR presence in that area, makes our movement pattern appear more routine." As they resumed their journey, Mason found himself reflecting on the confrontation they had narrowly navigated. The operator's determination confirmed the significance of Atlas's escape. Whatever program had employed him clearly considered his recovery a priority worth significant operational risk. This realization only strengthened Mason's resolve to ensure the Malinois reached safety and received the protection his service had earned. The forestry vehicles came into view as they approached the trail intersection, their heavy-duty trucks equipped with snowplows and maintenance equipment. Officer Gonzalez exchanged professional greetings with the crew supervisor, maintaining their cover story while gathering useful intelligence about road conditions ahead and any unusual activity observed in the area. Atlas remained vigilant throughout this interaction, his attention continuously scanning their surroundings with professional thoroughness. The dog's tactical awareness matched Mason's own combat-honed vigilance, both constantly evaluating potential threats and escape routes with automatic precision. As they continued beyond the intersection, following the maintenance paths that would lead them toward their new extraction coordinates, Mason allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. They had successfully navigated the first direct confrontation, demonstrating that their adversaries, while professional and determined, were not invulnerable. The journey ahead remained challenging, with unknown obstacles and potential pursuers still threatening their progress. Yet Mason found himself experiencing something unfamiliar after years of isolated existence: the quiet satisfaction of purposeful action in service to something beyond himself. Whether this newfound sense of purpose would last beyond their current mission remained uncertain, but for now it provided clarity and focus that transcended the dangers surrounding them. The maintenance paths Officer Gonzalez had chosen provided both advantage and challenge as they continued their journey. These narrow service routes, primarily used by conservation personnel maintaining the watershed infrastructure, wound through terrain too rugged for casual visitors. Dense pine groves alternated with sudden clearings where massive granite outcroppings broke through the snow cover, creating a landscape that demanded constant vigilance and precise navigation. For Mason, the technical riding requirements provided welcome focus, drawing his attention to immediate physical challenges rather than dwelling on the confrontation they had narrowly escaped. Each difficult section required complete concentration, navigating between tightly spaced trees, maintaining traction on ice-slicked inclines, calculating optimal approach angles for snow-covered obstacles. This immersion in practical problems had always provided him reliable refuge from psychological pressure, a pattern established during his military service and maintained throughout his subsequent isolation. Atlas seemed equally engaged by their challenging route, his posture in the transport compartment shifting with each maneuver as if mentally participating in the navigation decisions. The dog's remarkable situational awareness had become increasingly evident throughout their journey. He consistently oriented toward potential threat directions before Mason himself had fully processed the tactical considerations, demonstrating the advanced environmental assessment training characteristic of elite military working dogs. After nearly an hour of challenging terrain, Officer Gonzalez signaled for a brief halt in a small clearing protected from view by a natural formation of rock and dense evergreens. This position offered both concealment and multiple exit routes, an ideal location for their necessary mid-journey assessment. "We're approximately 7 miles from the new extraction coordinates," she reported after consulting her GPS unit. "Road conditions ahead improve considerably once we reach the eastern conservation boundary. Maintained gravel access road for the final 3 miles. Mason nodded acknowledgement while checking Atlas's condition through the transport compartment. The Malinois appeared alert, but showed signs of fatigue from the prolonged journey. His breathing slightly labored, his injured leg held at an angle, suggesting increased discomfort despite the specialized padding supporting it. "He needs a brief rest and hydration," Mason decided, retrieving a collapsible water bowl and sealed container of fresh water from his supplies. The vibration from rough terrain has likely aggravated his injury. Officer Gonzalez scanned their surroundings with professional thoroughness, while Mason attended to Atlas. "No signs of pursuit so far, but we should assume they're regrouping and developing alternative intercept strategies. These operators clearly have significant resources and determination." The assessment aligned with Mason's own tactical evaluation. Their confrontation had disrupted the operator's immediate recovery attempt, but wouldn't deter a team with professional training and apparent governmental backing. The temporary withdrawal likely represented tactical repositioning rather than mission abandonment. As Mason offered water to Atlas, who drank with disciplined moderation, despite obvious thirst, Officer Gonzalez made a brief radio check with her department dispatch. The standardized communication maintained their cover story while confirming normal operations throughout the conservation area, valuable intelligence regarding any unusual activity that might indicate their pursuers' movements. "All sectors reporting routine conditions," she informed Mason after completing the transmission. "No unidentified vehicles or personnel observed by other patrols. Either they've withdrawn completely or they're maintaining extremely low visibility." "The latter," Mason stated with certainty born of combat experience. "These aren't individuals who abandon objectives easily. They're reassessing and adapting just as we are." Officer Gonzalez accepted this evaluation without question, her own law enforcement background apparently providing sufficient tactical understanding to recognize the pattern Mason described. Their professional cooperation had developed remarkable efficiency despite their brief acquaintance, each contributing specialized knowledge while respecting the other's expertise. After allowing Atlas 10 minutes of rest, they prepared to resume their journey. Mason checked the splint on the dog's leg, making minor adjustments to improve support based on subtle signs of discomfort he had observed. The Malinois remained perfectly still during this treatment, his discipline unwavering despite evident pain. "Your recovery rate continues to impress me," Mason told him quietly, securing the final wrap with practiced precision. "But even elite operators have limitations. Accept support when necessary. It's not weakness, but tactical wisdom." Atlas responded with attentive focus, his intelligent eyes tracking Mason's movements with apparent comprehension. The connection between them had deepened progressively throughout their journey, transcending conventional handler-dog relationships through their shared experience of danger and mutual protection. As they secured equipment and prepared to depart, Officer Gonzalez paused, her expression shifting from professional focus to thoughtful consideration. "Something's been bothering me since the confrontation," she said, lowering her voice, though no one else was present to overhear. The operator referred to Atlas as federal property and an asset rather than using standard terminology for military working dogs. That phrasing implies something beyond normal service dog protocols. Mason considered his response carefully, balancing operational security against Officer Gonzalez's legitimate concerns and valuable assistance. "You're right," he acknowledged finally. "Whatever program Atlas escaped from operates outside standard military working dog protocols. The details remain unclear, but the evidence suggests something unauthorized and potentially illegal. This measured disclosure satisfied Officer Gonzalez's immediate question without compromising the more sensitive aspects of their situation. Her professional experience had clearly enabled her to recognize the anomalies in their encounter, making continued pretense counterproductive to the trust necessary for their partnership. "That explains their unusual operational approach," she concluded, processing this confirmation against her own observations. "No identifying insignia, ambiguous jurisdiction claims, emphasis on recovery over proper identification, classic hallmarks of deniable operations." Her analytical assessment impressed Mason, demonstrating law enforcement training comparable to military intelligence in its attention to operational patterns and procedural irregularities. This shared professional framework enhanced their tactical coordination despite their different backgrounds. They resumed their journey with renewed urgency, now fully aware that time worked against them as their pursuers reorganized and potentially mobilized additional resources. Officer Gonzalez set a more aggressive pace, leveraging her intimate knowledge of the conservation area to maximize efficiency without compromising safety. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.